I've seen a lot of beautiful things online that would look lovely in here. My targeted advertising is unnervingly accurate.
He didn't move to the countryside to chase a dream. He moved because there was nothing left to stay for. Jude Harper had built a real business, owned a home, and had a life that looked, from the outside, completely sorted. And then, in the space of a few years, he lost both of his parents to cancer, one after the other. And instead of pushing through the way most people do, quietly drowning while the routine keeps ticking, he did something that most people only think about. He burned the whole thing down, sold the house, shut the business, got in his car, and drove across Scotland with 9 months of savings and no plan. What he built next, almost nobody saw coming, including him. The man before the collapse. And here's what makes Jude's story hit differently. He wasn't running from failure. He was running from a life that had genuinely worked. Before any of this, Jude Harper was the founder of Stranded Dye Works, a hand-dyed yarn business he launched around 2015, starting out in his parents' kitchen, dyeing yarn by hand for the knitting and textile world. That detail matters more than it sounds. Because the kitchen where he first mixed colors and learned his craft, the same space where that business was born, belonged to the two people he was about to lose. Over nearly 8 years, he grew Stranded Dye Works from a kitchen hobby into a respected name in the fiber arts industry, complete with a dedicated industrial dye studio, a weekly video podcast, and a loyal following. He owned a house, he had income, he had routine, and he was good at what he did. But here is the thing about building a life around purpose. When the people who gave that purpose meaning disappear, the whole structure starts to feel hollow. Jude has talked about how the motivation that had carried him through almost a decade just evaporated. Not slowly, not gradually, overnight. He described feeling burnt out, exhausted, and completely cut off from the life he had spent years constructing. The orders kept coming in. The business kept running. The world kept moving. And Jude kept showing up, going through the motions, while something underneath had already gone quiet. By 2023, he knew he was in the deepest rut of his life. And more importantly, he knew that if he didn't make a drastic move, he was going to stay there. What that move actually looked like is where the story gets complicated. The calls that changed everything. Most people can imagine losing one parent. It's devastating, it's disorienting, it reshapes the way you see the world. But Jude didn't get one call. He got two. His mother was diagnosed with cancer first. And then, before that loss had anywhere near finished settling, his father was diagnosed as well. Both of them gone, one after the other. Now, there's a specific kind of grief that comes not just from losing someone, but from losing the entire world that person represented. Jude's mother was the person he sent photos to every week. Not big updates, not announcements, just small pictures of whatever he was working on that week. A project, a repair, something he'd fixed or made. Just a quiet way of saying, "Here's what I've been up to." That ritual, that small weekly thread connecting him to his mother, just stopped. Not because he chose to end it, because there was no one left to receive it. And his father was a man who used tools. Hammers, saws, measuring tapes, the kind of equipment that lives in a shed and carries the fingerprints of decades of work. Those tools would eventually follow Jude to a stone cottage in rural Scotland that hadn't even entered the picture yet. But we'll get to that. What matters here is the compounded weight of what Jude was carrying. The kitchen where Stranded Dye Works was born, gone. The woman who received those weekly photos, gone. The man whose tools sat in storage, waiting, gone. And Jude was still standing in the middle of a business, a house, a routine, a life that had been built in relationship to people who no longer existed. That's not ordinary grief. That's a complete collapse of context. He's spoken about how he started asking a much darker question than what project to tackle next. He wasn't thinking about colorways or dye batches or content schedules. He was sitting with something much heavier. Why am I still doing any of this? 9 months and no plan. This is the part of the story where most people would expect a neat pivot, a moment of clarity, a new direction, maybe a therapist or a life coach or a sabbatical with a plan attached to it. That's not what happened. In 2024, Jude made a decision that, even by his own admission, was completely out of character. He closed Stranded Dye Works after nearly a decade. He put his house on the market. And then he got in his car and started driving across Scotland with 9 months of savings, no destination, and no plan beyond the vague intention of finding somewhere that felt right to start over. No short list of towns, no estate agent, no spreadsheet of properties with pros and cons columns, just a recently bereaved, recently unemployed man driving through the Scottish countryside, looking for a place that didn't feel like the life he was leaving behind. What makes this even more striking is something Jude has said about himself. He is, by his own description, a person who normally has backup plans for his backup plans. He's methodical. He thinks things through. And this time, he had nothing. Just his savings, which would last roughly 9 months, and the open road. He looked at properties in Inverness, on the Isle of Skye, along the west coast, and in several parts of Aberdeenshire, before something stopped him. A small stone cottage in rural Aberdeenshire. Thick walls, low ceilings, an attached barn that needed serious structural work. Less than an acre of land. Water from a well. Heat from a fireplace. The nearest neighbor was a complete stranger who had no idea the new arrival had just dismantled his entire life to be there. Jude moved in with what he could carry and a head full of uncertainty. He described it as simultaneously freeing and terrifying. And in one of the more honest things he said about the whole experience, he noted that it's easy to stay miserable because staying miserable feels like the safer option. He chose the harder one. The clock started the moment he unpacked. When the romance ended and the reality began. Here's what the comfortable version of this story would look like. Man moves to the countryside, finds peace, bakes bread by a fire, develops a photogenic morning routine. That version doesn't exist. The first weeks in the cottage were, by Jude's own account, genuinely awful. And the details are worth sitting with, because this is where the story stops being inspirational and starts being real. He didn't know how a septic tank worked. He didn't know how to manage a private water supply. He had no experience with wood-burning heat systems, no background in construction or plumbing, no knowledge of rural land management, and not a single contact in the area. He was completely alone, in the middle of northeastern Scotland, in a building that was actively falling apart around him. There were nights when something fell down the chimney and smoke filled the cottage. There were weeks with no running water because the well ran dry during a dry stretch, and he was getting through each day on bottled water. No hot water for weeks at a time. Every time he stepped outside, there was more work staring back at him. The barn was deteriorating. The land was overgrown. The cottage itself needed renovation from top to bottom, and his savings were draining week by week, whether anything got fixed or not. What made the isolation sharper was the geography. Aberdeenshire is not the romantic highlands that most people picture when they imagine rural Scotland. It's remote in a quieter, less cinematic way. Deliveries cost extra because couriers classify it as a hard-to-reach zone. The roads don't have the drama of the West Coast. It's just land, and distance, and silence. And in those early weeks, that silence had weight. There were no colleagues dropping by, no casual conversations at the office, no background noise of a life shared with other people. Just the wind, the stone walls, and the slow realization that wanting a fresh start and actually surviving one are two very different things. He has admitted that for about 2 weeks, he genuinely believed he had made the biggest mistake of his life. And the isolation wasn't just logistical. There was no one to call. No parents, no partner, no colleagues. Just him, the stone walls, and the silence. But here's what kept him moving when every rational reason to quit was stacking up against him. In that shed full of tools, the hammers and saws and measuring tapes that used to belong to his father, Jude had something that no amount of money or planning could have given him. Every time he reached for one of those tools, he was holding something his father had held, building something new with the instruments of a man who was gone. That shed didn't just hold equipment, it held the closest thing to company he had. He called what he was doing rewilding, not just the land, but himself, stripping everything back to see what was still alive underneath. The camera that replaced the photos. Remember those weekly photos Jude used to send his mother? The small updates, the look, what I'm working on pictures? When she died, that ritual ended. But the impulse behind it didn't. The need to show someone, to share the small victories and the progress and the mess of everyday making. That need was still there. It just had nowhere to go. So Jude picked up a camera. He had some experience from the Stranded Die Works days, where he had hosted a weekly video podcast, so filming wasn't entirely foreign territory. But this was completely different in intention. He wasn't building a brand. He wasn't marketing a product. He was a man who had lost the people he used to share his daily life with, trying to find another way to keep that impulse alive. He started uploading videos under the name Rewilding Jude, just filming his days, the cottage, the projects, the failures, the small wins. The first few videos barely registered. Then came his third upload, a simple walkthrough of the cottage. No production value, no script, just Jude moving through the stone rooms of this rundown place he had staked everything on. He thought maybe a few hundred people from his old knitting community might watch it. That video has since crossed 400,000 views. The channel grew faster than anything Jude had planned, which is to say, it grew at all, because he hadn't planned it. Week after week, the numbers climbed. People left comments that ran to paragraphs, sharing their own stories of loss, of starting over, of finding something in his footage they hadn't been able to articulate. The 9-month savings deadline that had been hanging over everything suddenly had a possible answer attached to it. But what actually drove the growth wasn't aesthetics or algorithm tricks. It was the disasters. Jude doesn't edit out his mistakes. He leaves them in because, as he puts it, otherwise the videos would be very short. The chicken coop is the clearest example. He planned to build it in 3 weeks. It took 3 months, consumed the entire summer, and ended up so elaborate that viewers started calling it a palace. He filmed himself staring blankly at a tape measure because he had forgotten how to process basic numbers. He filmed wrong cuts, structures that didn't fit together, projects torn down and restarted from scratch. 4 to 5 days of filming every single week. No production team, no second takes. He keeps careful boundaries around it. When people visit, the camera goes off. When he's genuinely struggling, he doesn't perform that struggle for an audience. There's a clear line between honesty and exploitation, and he holds it. And that restraint is part of what makes the channel trustworthy. Audiences have spent years being trained to spot performance dressed up as authenticity. They know the difference between someone who is genuinely figuring things out and someone who is playing the role of a person figuring things out. Jude lands firmly in the first category, and his comment section reflects it. People write about watching his videos through illness, through their own bereavements, through periods where they needed proof that starting over was survivable. That's not a typical YouTube comment section. That's something closer to a support group built around a man and his crumbling cottage. What the audience responded to wasn't the renovation content. It was the fact that someone on the internet was visibly, genuinely trying and visibly, genuinely, not always, getting it right. In a space full of performed competence, Jude's willingness to look lost on camera turned out to be the most compelling thing he could have offered. What he actually built. Among the most unexpectedly meaningful chapters of the whole story are 4 hens. Rescued through the British Hen Welfare Trust, a charity that has rehomed over 1 million commercially farmed hens across the United Kingdom since 2005, these were birds that had been days away from slaughter when Jude brought them home to that over-engineered 3-month palace of a chicken coop. He had never kept hens before. The trust walked him through the basics. The handover went smoothly, and then something happened that Jude genuinely did not anticipate. The chickens wrecked him, in the best possible way. He has described them as the most unexpectedly joyful thing to arrive in his life since the move. And if you sit with that for a moment, it hits harder than it probably should. A man who lost both parents, who drove across a country with no destination, who stood alone in a smoke-filled cottage at 3 in the morning, wondering if he'd destroyed his own life. That man is now, every morning, walking out to a coop he built with his own hands, using his father's tools to care for 4 birds that would have been dead without him. Animals that were given a second chance by someone who was quietly in the middle of his own. Today, Rewilding Jude has crossed 150,000 subscribers and over 10 million total views. Every Sunday, a new video goes up. He's built raised garden beds, constructed a hinged hoop house, grown and harvested vegetables, foraged from the land, torn down parts of the cottage and rebuilt them from scratch. He's cooked meals from food he grew himself and lit fires with wood he cut himself. The projects multiply faster than he can finish them. The cottage will always need work. That's not a problem. That's the point. What's worth pausing on is how much of this Jude had to learn from nothing. He came into this with no construction background, no gardening knowledge, no experience with livestock or land, or any of the practical skills this life was going to demand. Everything he has built, he figured out as he went. The raised beds came after failed attempts. The hoop house came after understanding what the Scottish winter does to an exposed garden. The food preservation, the foraging, the firewood, all of it learned on the job, in real time, on camera, with the mistakes left in. There's no shortcut in that. It's just accumulated competence, built slowly, through repetition and failure and trying again. Because here is what becomes clear when you follow the whole arc of this story. The work was never really about the cottage. It was about having something that demanded his presence, something that required his hands, his attention, his problem-solving, his patience, something that made him move when grief had made standing still feel like the only option. He went from running a business that had lost its meaning to building a life that slowly, imperfectly, and sometimes disastrously is finding it again. Not in one turning point, not in one dramatic moment of clarity. One project at a time, one wrong measurement at a time, one Sunday video at a time, one rescued hen at a time. And every Sunday, without fail, he picks up the camera, walks through the cottage, the garden, the coop, shows the world what he's been working on that week, the repairs, the disasters, the small things that went right. Over 10 million people have watched, strangers from everywhere, tuning in every week to see what Jude's been up to. Jude still uploads every Sunday, and every Sunday, he's essentially doing the same thing he was doing when he sent those photos to his mother, showing someone what he's been working on. The person he built that habit for is gone, but the habit itself refused to die. It just found a new address. There's something in that worth sitting with, because most people, when they lose the person they were doing something for, they stop doing the thing. Jude didn't. And it's hard to know whether that's grief or stubbornness or just the way some people are wired. So here's what we're genuinely curious about. Is there something in your life that you kept doing after the person you did it for was gone? Or something you stopped and maybe wonder if you should have kept going? Drop it in the comments. Because based on what people are writing on Jude's videos every week, this is clearly something a lot of people are carrying around quietly, and it's worth saying out loud. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.